were that were detailed in the report, and we'll also have time, I think, for questions as well. So we'll go ahead and get started. So a little bit about Stilletto. So Stilletto Consulting is a market research and strategic planning firm, and we specialize in high impact projects for communities and institutions. And we really work sort of at the intersection of government, industry, and academia to help to better understand and activate economic and social growth in communities, in provinces, counties, cities, and within organizations. And certainly this project has really exemplified, I think, so well what that intersection really means, because it's pretty clear to us through our research, both the primary research we did, interviewing probably many of the folks who are in the virtual or physical room today, as well as some of our secondary research, the importance of really those three components, government, industry, and academia really working together. Okay, so the project purpose. So the purpose was to conduct an economic impact assessment to evaluate both the current and potential future impacts of the wild blueberry industry in Nova Scotia. And as has been said just in really the last 20 minutes, to just sort of firmly root ourselves in the current context, we do understand that this hasn't been a great year for wild blueberry farms and farmers. As has been said, the cost of production has gone up, the harvest is behind, and farm gate prices are down. But which has also been articulated, we certainly feel that there are many reasons to be optimistic. And, it's part of why we're really, really happy and grateful to be with you today to provide you some of that data that certainly has made us feel very optimistic, and we're assured it will make you feel optimistic about the future as well. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Rosalind, who will go through some of those impacts and a little bit of the sort of backstory to the project itself. So over to you, Roz.
Thank you, Tara, and thanks everyone for giving us the time and space to speak with you today about the project we conducted. So this first little section I'm going to go over is some of the secondary research pieces we found that kind of speak to the current context and a bit of historic context about where Nova Scotia stands relative to other producing regions in Canada as well as Maine. So if we can look at the next slide. So this here shows the distribution of production across producing provinces in Maine as well. So as you can see, Nova Scotia is actually the fourth largest producing region, just behind PEI. In 2022, the 5-year average production volume was almost 41 million pounds of blueberries. But despite being only the fourth largest producer among these regions, Nova Scotia has a long history and specialization in wild blueberry production, which is demonstrated in the following slide. So if you actually look at the acreage dedicated to wild blueberries across regions, Nova Scotia actually has the largest share of farms and total acres dedicated to wild blueberry production. So as of 2021, about 14.5% of Nova Scotia's total acres of cropland were used for wild blueberry production, and 22% of the farmers in Nova Scotia identified as wild blueberry producers. And this is actually, for both pieces, that's the highest concentration, the highest share across all producing provinces. So it really demonstrates that Nova Scotia, even though its production volume isn't as large as the other regions, its specialization is the highest. And then we also see in the data indications that Nova Scotia's farms are becoming increasingly efficient. So between 2011 and 2021, if you look at the 5-year rolling average production volumes across the 4 major producing provinces in Canada, all of those provinces have seen pretty notable increases in total production over that period. However, in the cases of PEI and New Brunswick, these have also been accompanied by really large increases in the amount of land and bearing acres dedicated to wild blueberries. But if you look at Nova Scotia and Quebec, these 2 provinces actually saw declines in land. Now, Quebec's decline in acreage was very small at only about 4%. However, in Nova Scotia, there was a 12.7% decline in the amount of bearing acres for wild blueberry production, but this is actually accompanied by an increase of 22.3% in terms of production volume. So that really speaks to the fact that Nova Scotia farms are quite efficient and doing a lot with declining land. And for this next section, these pieces really come from the primary research that we conducted throughout the project, which Tara mentioned. So we conducted interviews with various industry stakeholders. And through these conversations, we identified 3 kind of major themes in terms of challenges that the industry seems to be facing. And I'm sure none of these will come as any surprise to anyone here today. But those 3 main themes are environmental, technical, and economic challenges. So on the environmental side, as has been discussed already, environmental challenges include climate change and adaptation, the existence and increase of invasive pests and weeds, and challenges around pollination and the supply of pollinators. So while these challenges obviously present really dire, sometimes, circumstances for growers, from what we've gathered through our conversations, there are great examples of farmers and farms meeting this challenge with innovative techniques. So, for example, some of the people we spoke to discussed the use of weather stations and heat degree mapping to help them plan their input schedules around these unpredictable weather patterns. And this has helped them really adapt and mitigate some of the damage that can be done as a result of those extreme weather events. In addition to that, around the issue of pollinators, we've spoken to farmers who have begun opening their own and operating their own apiaries on their farms. And not only has this provided them with a more stable supply of pollinators, but it's also introduced a new revenue stream for their operations by allowing them to produce and sell their own honey. So there's just a couple of examples of the ways that industry is meeting the really difficult challenge of changing environmental conditions. The other category of challenge we identified was more on the technical side. And this is where a lot of the research and development that's done in partnership with university researchers comes into play. So some of the researchers we spoke to discussed one of the major priorities right now in terms of technological development is doing what they called softening the harvest. So with the use of mechanical harvesters becoming the norm in the industry, this has really improved the efficiency of harvesting. However, there is a high level of contact between the teeth of the harvester and the leaves of the plant. And even though this is great for increasing the efficiency, it can damage plant health. And so really a big research priority right now is developing ways to help protect the health of the plant, even with the use of the harvesters. And then, of course, the third challenge is economic. And this really takes 2 major forms, which is price stability and labor shortages. So as I'm sure we all know here, the farm gate price for wild blueberries is highly volatile and it fluctuates dramatically year over year. And of course, this can make it really challenging for producers who are unsure of what their next year's revenue is going to be, let alone 5 years, 10 years from now. And it can make it quite difficult to secure funding from banks or other funders who would generally prefer to see a more stable annual revenue. And then, of course, there are labor shortages. So all of New Brunswick, and especially many agricultural industries, face the issue of an aging workforce. And for many agricultural industries, and wild blueberries is no exception, sourcing younger and eager new workforce into the industry is a challenge. Both training and retaining that workforce as well is a big challenge for industry. And from these challenges, we really took the analysis a step further and looked at ways where, in order to meet these challenges, industry and various levels of government can work together and see where the priorities kind of align between those various levels of governance. And I know Tara spent some great time on this analysis, so I'll turn it back over to her for this piece.
Thanks, Roz. Yeah, so we had identified about 6 key opportunities for increased policy alignment. So we go into quite a bit of detail on these in the report. So what we've included here are just some high-level, bullets to help to sort of see where the association has an opportunity to increase alignment between itself and various levels of government. So the first is creating more awareness around both the health and environmental benefits of wild blueberries. So that was just mentioned before our presentation. So that certainly was our finding, that there is great opportunity. And, certainly by creating that awareness, you're helping to define that differentiator in people's minds in a really clear way, which is important. Advocating and supporting for production and harvest innovation. So certainly it's really clear, as Roz has talked about in the data, that the province is leveraging innovation to yield more blueberries. And we feel like that is, something that needs to remain a priority in the future. So I think continued work with research partners that are already in place. We did chat with a few researchers, and those partnerships are so very important. Advocating for policies to address labor shortages. We did hear stories about farms that were really trying to sort of mitigate the challenge of labor shortages in some really creative ways, and did come up against some roadblocks at various levels of government. In some cases, it does seem to be an issue of bureaucracy, and in other cases, it seems to really be sort of a policy roadblock itself. So I think the association has a really important role to play there in helping to advocate for a more streamlined policy. Advocating for pollination diversity and growth. So as Roz said, we certainly highlighted that as a challenge. Increasing awareness of and access to wild blueberries. So there was some, really great programs that we came across in talking to stakeholders and through our research that the association is already doing. Some of the programs in schools, embedding information about wild blueberries into curriculum, working with teachers so that when students are going home, they are able to talk to their parents about some of these points of differentiation. I think those kinds of programs, to me, are exemplars and, should definitely be continued. And continued leadership and advocacy to increase R&D innovation. So, very much connected to production and harvest innovations, but also, I think even beyond that, ways that R&D can be used to try to mitigate things like the impact of climate change. These will all be really important in the future. Okay, so the next section that we're going to talk about is the impact assessment itself. So I'm going to pass it back to Roz.
Okay, thank you, Tara. So yeah, the real meat of this project was the economic impact assessment. And in order to get a really full picture of the whole broad range of impacts that this industry has, we looked at basically 6 different areas of activity within the industry that contribute to the overall economic impact. So, of course, there is primary production, which is the crop production. So that's farmers growing and harvesting the wild blueberries. We also looked at processing and preserving. And then we took a look at value-added production as well, fresh pack production, harvester manufacturing and supply. And then we also took a look at the research and development impacts. So both the impacts of the research spending itself, and then also the impacts of for example, the increased productivity that has resulted from the innovation that results from that research and development. So first, we took a look at some historic data and looked at the historic impacts of crop production. So I will note that we only had access to historic data for the actual crop production itself, but not the other streams of activity that take place. So when we see these numbers here, this is only looking at the economic impact arising from the growing and harvesting of the blueberries. But even just looking at that one factor, we do see that these impacts are quite significant. So when we look at data from 2013, we see that based on the production volume of that year, we're looking at an economic impact of 14.5 million in provincial GDP based on the 5-year average production of that year. So this means that the activity of farmers in Nova Scotia contributed 14.5 million in GDP to the province of Nova Scotia that year. In addition to that, or included in that, I should say, is 9.9 million in labor income paid to workers and operators in the industry. We also estimated about 3.2 million in taxes as a result of crop production, and those are taxes paid to all levels of government, but most of that remains in the province to provincial and local governments. And then on top of that, we also estimated about 8.7 million in total household spending. So that figure there is quite important, and we discuss it in a little more detail throughout this presentation and in more detail in the report. But that household spending impact is really important because, as I'm sure you're all aware, wild blueberry farms are operating in smaller rural communities. And so that household spending number really represents, for the most part, spending that's taking place in local businesses, and those smaller regions are really benefiting from a lot of economic activity that is made possible by the presence of the wild blueberry industry in those communities. So that's in 2013. Looking ahead from that, at 2017, we see, based on the increases in those 5-year averages in production volume, in 2017, the provincial GDP impact actually increased by a little over 10 million to be 24.7 million in 2017 in provincial GDP. Also seeing an increase in total labor income as well. So about 10.7 million paid to workers and operators in the crop production in 2017, about 3.7 million paid in total taxes, and 9.4 million paid or in household spending that's generated again by the presence of the wild blueberry industry. So that's a bit of a historic picture, looking just at crop production alone. Now, we also looked at current and future impacts based on a couple of different growth scenarios. But before I get into that, I'll just give an overview of what we estimated as being the total impact as of 2022 based on the 5-year average production volume in 2022, as well as the annual average impacts of the other activities in wild blueberry, in the wild blueberry industry, which I highlighted in the previous slide, that being processing, preserving, value-added production, fresh pack, and the production and supply of harvesters. So as of 2022, when we take all of those different activities combined, we're looking at a really significant provincial GDP impact of 91.5 million in Nova Scotia, just from wild blueberries alone. We also estimate about 1,806 jobs across all those different areas within the province. And then from that, about 55.9 million in labor income, and then 19.2 million in taxes, and 48.4 million in household spending. So those are really significant when you look at the sector altogether. Now, I'll move on and discuss a little bit about the future impacts we estimated. So in the full report, we detail that we do look at 3 different growth scenarios. We had a minimum growth scenario, a expected growth scenario, and a stretch goal. The numbers you see here for the future impact are based on the expected growth scenario, but I will note that the stretch goal scenario, as well as the minimum growth scenario, the growth for all of those are quite feasible based on historic production of the industry. So these are just sort of like a midpoint estimation of what you could expect to see, but these impacts could very well be higher given potential further increases in production by the industry. So we did a 10-year forecast to 2032, and under the expected growth scenario, which I believe was 75 million pounds by 2032 as annual production, we're looking at 147 million in provincial GDP, which is a significant increase from what we see in 2022. For employment, we also see significant growth at a little over 2,000 jobs in the province resulting from the industry. As well, for labor income, significant increase there as well at 89.9 million. And then 30.8 million paid in taxes. And again, that's to all levels of government, but provincial and local governments do see the bulk of that remaining in province. And then finally, that household spending impact is estimated at about 77.8 million annually at that expected growth production level. So those are really significant impacts. And we see even under a reasonable growth scenario, really high increases in the impacts that the industry is having within its community and its province broadly. And then the other piece we wanted to look at with the project, and that we go into more detail in the full report, is some of the other social benefits that the industry is bringing to the province and specifically to its rural communities that are very beneficial and often just as important as economic impacts, but aren't necessarily captured in economic modeling and things that you can't necessarily put a dollar sign on. So we identified 6 main benefits that the industry is bringing to the province and to its local rural communities. So the first one we looked at was providing job opportunities for seasonal workforce and other industries. So oftentimes in smaller and more rural communities, there are a larger share of seasonal workforce or part-time workers who are able to increase their time spent employed throughout the year as a result of the job opportunities for seasonal work that are created by the wild blueberry industry in those smaller communities. The other part we looked at as well, and Tara has already touched on this, is promoting health and fighting disease. So of course, we all know the wild blueberry is the superfruit, and as part of a healthy lifestyle and diet can help promote health and fight disease. And the presence of the wild blueberry industry in a small province and having such a large presence in that province really does help promote that healthy diet and lifestyle to small communities and the province broadly. We also discussed the industry's capacity to sustain rural communities. So, as you know, farms are mostly in those rural and small communities. And oftentimes, the people in these communities have less access to businesses and are less likely to have a lot of economic activity and impacts generated in them. But at the same time, as much as it would be nice to have those things, a lot of people in those communities don't necessarily want to be in a big city. They don't want to be in those economic hubs. However, the presence of such a large industry that is generating such significant economic activity within those communities, it helps to sustain that lifestyle while still providing significant job opportunities and activity within those small communities. And then, of course, the industry also helps to boost tourism in smaller communities as well. So, of course, with the growth of agritourism and gastrotourism, those are significantly growing industries globally, and wild blueberries have a huge potential for growth there. So even now, though, despite the potential for further growth, it's already bringing significant tourism to these areas through U-pick operations and wineries that may exist and have the potential to grow in those rural communities as well. So that's outsiders coming in and bringing their money and spending it in these small communities and helping to support and sustain small businesses. And then, of course, there is the protection of pollinators that we looked at as well. And more broadly, just the fact that unlike a lot of other agricultural operations, wild blueberry production does have a much lower impact on the environment because farmers are simply cultivating a plant that is already native to that soil rather than some of those big industrial agricultural operations you might see elsewhere. And part of that also helps to help sustain pollinator populations within Nova Scotia. And then finally, we did want to go into detail, and we do provide some detail as well, of just about the historical importance of the wild blueberry industry to Nova Scotia. So some of the research we did and we discuss in the full report discusses the importance of wild blueberries as a food staple for Indigenous populations. Some of the first instances of trade between settlers and Indigenous populations was the trade of wild blueberries. And it was also a food staple for the first settlers who came to Nova Scotia as well. And so the growth and the continued growth and sustaining of the wild blueberry in Nova Scotia, it's not just preserving history of the province, it's also helping to grow it and develop it and continue that heritage from the province. So in conclusion, of course, as we've heard today, the wild blueberry industry does face a lot of adversity, and it's exemplified by this current season's challenges. But the industry has had a really long history, and there is demonstrated dedication to research and innovation. And that is just one indicator of the resiliency of the industry and the people who are operating in it. So the industry, it contributes substantially to Nova Scotia as a whole, and in particular to its rural communities, and helps to sustain small communities and their way of life by generating significant economic activity for them.
Thanks, Roz. Thank you so much for your time. I know we've done a lot of talking, so we are really happy to answer any questions that you might have. I'll maybe just stop sharing my screen so we can see folks a bit better. So I'll turn things back over, and if there are mics in the physical room, that would be great, or happy to take questions from folks in the virtual room as well.
Anyone have any questions?